This is ARPL 519, Survey of American Architecture. We're going to cover the years from 1600 to the 1850s. My name is Dr. Christina Wilson, and I will be your instructor. We are going to start at the very beginning, which is always a good place to start. And I think it's always good, just like you do when you are at a gym and you're warming up, we need to warm up and sort of get our feet wet a little bit in this subject matter. Now, I like to start with cartoons because it's always good to have a sense of humor about these things. And the first thing I want to say is that history has a tendency to have kind of a bad reputation. And when I say history has a bad reputation, well, let's get to the reputation thing in just a second. But the first thing I want to say is let's define what history is. History is a chronological record of significant past events, and that includes an explanation of their causes and significance. History is also an established record of past events. It is a discipline or branch of knowledge that records and explains past events. And it is a treatise or written record presenting systematically related ideas or phenomena from the past. So those are definitions of history, just to get you thinking about what history is. This, unfortunately, is what I think most people think when you talk about history. Now, it was very nice. I saw that some of you said, oh, I love history, I'm a history nut, whatever. But history does have a reputation, at least in some circles, of being boring. And, you know, the cartoons are endless. History repeats itself, which is why it's so boring. And I think my favorite is the guy on life support because he is so bored by history. And that's funny, but it's not really that funny. And so what we need to do is unpack what history is. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to explore and understand what architects think history is. And is that really what history is? So that is the first question. And this is a series of images that kind of gets to the heart of this issue. Now, of course, we've got Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, and this guy is really sort of the personification of the architect. And you can just imagine, he's looking at the building and saying, oh dear. You could just imagine, he's sort of, oh, that's so unfortunate. And, you know, if you look at Frank Lloyd Wright's pose here, not that far afield. And of course, Corbusier always looks like he's, you know, annoyed about something, you know, whatever. So how does this show us, or how does this reveal how architects think about history? And what we need to understand and really appreciate is that architects have a tendency to look at history the way you would hear people talk about art in a museum. Now, it's hard to go to museums these days, but the National Gallery and some other art galleries in town are open if you make an appointment. And it's always a really good exercise and also amusing to go to a museum and just sit there and listen to people talk about the art. It's actually pretty funny, especially if you're someone like me who knows a lot about the art. I was a art history major as an undergrad, and I know a lot about art, as you'll soon find out. And it's really fun to listen to people talk about art. And you can just imagine these two. Ooh, the brush strokes. Ooh, the lines and the forms and the color. Ooh. So there's this whole sort of aesthete connoisseurship approach. And there's also this issue, especially with modern or 20th century art, that if you don't get it, that there's something like you're unhip or uncool, that like there's some sort of inside club understanding of these things. And that really dates back to the notion of connoisseurship. Connoisseurship is a product of the Enlightenment. It is very much a part of the thinking and quest for knowledge in what is called the Age of Reason in the 18th century. And connoisseurship is a very big part of this. And what happens in the 18th century is that there are all these folks in Europe in particular who they travel and they gather up artifacts, paintings, and other gewgaws and stuff from past centuries. And they start looking at it and thinking about it and cataloging it and putting it in some sort of order. But remember that a big part of connoisseurship is making a judgment. And it is making a judgment based on formal characteristics. In other words, what the thing looks like. So this whole notion of connoisseurship actually goes back a long ways. In some ways, it goes back to this gentleman, Giorgio Vasari, who wrote what is sometimes called the first book of art history, which is the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects. And Vasari was a painter, did some architecture. He was primarily a painter. And in his view, Michelangelo was the bee's knees. Michelangelo was the greatest artist architect of all time. But the reason I bring him up is because even though he's writing about people that he knows, he was a contemporary of Michelangelo. He was about 35 years younger, but he knew a lot of these artists who we would now consider Renaissance artists. And he is often called the first art historian because in writing this book on the lives of these artists and architects, he also uses the word Renaissance for the first time. And Renaissance describes the rebirth of ancient artistic and architectural ideas with Alberti and others in Quattrocento, Italy. Now, why is that important? What Vasari is doing and what art and architectural historians start doing, especially in the 19th century, is they start categorizing the past. And in doing so, they impose stylistic or formal criteria in an effort to organize all this information. So the Renaissance, here it is, a timeline of European art history. The Renaissance, we're using this as an example because everybody is familiar with the word Renaissance, aren't they? Remember, Renaissance was not a term that was used while the people who were living during those years, they didn't say, hi, I'm a Renaissance artist, I'm a Renaissance architect. Renaissance is a word that is describing looking back at these things. And we're not going to get into this into a great deal of detail today. The point here is to explore how architects see history and what they think architectural history is all about. So here we have the categorization of all of this art and architecture into these periods: early Renaissance, Northern Renaissance, High Renaissance, Mannerism, okay? And this is historians, particularly in the 19th century, looking back and trying to organize all this information. So you may hear another, if we look in more detail at a term like the High Renaissance. The High Renaissance says it starts here, it ends here, and it fits here in this broader scheme of things. Remember, this whole notion of categorizing stuff are attempts to understand the developments of these sort of artistic and architectural developments. High Renaissance, for example, is a term that was first used by the art historian Jakob Burckhardt in 1855. And the reason I mention him is because all, with almost no exception, of the early art historians who also write about architecture, but mostly art, are German, and they all have a very particular way of looking at the past and categorizing it. And Jakob Burckhardt is not an exception. And he, in looking back at the Renaissance, he formulates the way the Renaissance is still studied today. And he celebrates, this is the most important part of this whole thing for us, he celebrates the individual artist and his quest for artistic or creative perfection. The key here is focusing on the individual, in this case, the individual artist. Jakob Burckhardt's most famous and most influential student was this gentleman, Heinrich Wülflin, and he writes these books. He writes Renaissance and Baroque. Now remember that his focus is exclusively art, but what Wülflin does is he creates this system of looking at the past and categorizing paintings versus whether they're Renaissance or whether they're Baroque. And what he does is he uses formal categories to describe all this stuff. Now, we're not going to get into this a lot today, but these are the 5 criteria, and this is what you learn in art history. Like, this is Art History 101. Is the painting linear versus painterly, plane versus recession, closed versus open, unity to multiplicity, or absolute clarity versus relative clarity? So what Heinrich Wilflin does is he looks at what he calls the Renaissance, and then he looks at the Baroque, and he lines up examples, and he says, well, this is Renaissance because it has these particular visual characteristics, and this is the Baroque because it has these particular characteristics. And if you start to think about this the way Heinrich Wilflin does, I think it's pretty clear when you look at 2 crucifixions. These are about 125 years apart. The one on the left is Renaissance. It's very clear, it's very symmetrical, it's relatively flat. There's very little perspective. There is 1-point perspective, but it's not very deep. It's very different than this so-called Baroque crucifixion, where there's a very deep sense of perspective, but it's also very dramatic. Notice that there's this emphasis on angles and light and all this kind of stuff. And if you look at several examples of this and you pair them this way, you can really see what we now call the Wilflinian approach to art. And you could stand in a museum and say, oh, that is a very linear versus very painterly. Why is this important? It's really important because the historians who codify architecture and design as it's studied in the 20th century are all trained in this kind of Germanic, German art history tradition that focuses on the individual and also looks at things exclusively in a formal way. In other words, they judge things based on what they look like. One of the most influential in the 20th century is this gentleman, Nicholas Pevsner. He's a German who studied in Germany. He moved to England in the late 20s, early 30s, and he became very interested in the English arts and crafts movement. He also met Walter Gropius, who had left Germany in the early 30s. They were both living in London, and Pevsner apparently was completely charmed by Gropius, who was very charismatic and all of this. Nicholas Pevsner writes this book, and it's first published in 1936, Pioneers of the Modern Movement. And basically what Pevsner does is he uses this German art historical formal analysis framework to assert that there is a direct formal or aesthetic connection between William Morris and the artists of the arts and crafts movement in England and the early Bauhaus designers of the 20th century, most represented or best represented by the work of Walter Gropius. And you can see this is how Pevsner sets it up. Here's from the 1851 to Morris and the arts and crafts. So he starts with Morris and the arts and crafts movement. He brings in painting. He talks about Art Nouveau. He talks about engineering. And he talks about England up until World War I. And then he brings in Gropius. He does this based on the formal or aesthetic characteristics that he feels run through that are similar. Here's the other part that's really important. He asserts that it was inevitable that what William Morris was doing and what engineers were doing and what Art Nouveau artists were doing inevitably leads to Gropius and the modern movement, and that it was like a foregone conclusion. Remember that Pevsner is doing this based not on looking at historical evidence in terms of relationships in other ways. The point that I want you to really understand is that he's doing it based on aesthetics only. Now, this book was renamed, and many of you probably have a copy of it. And I can guarantee that almost everybody who teaches at Catholic or teaches in any architecture school has a copy of this book. It was renamed Pioneers of Modern Design, and it's been in print ever since. And it's had lots of different covers. My My copy that I bought 30 years ago when I first went to graduate school looks like this. But it's been in print ever since. And this is one of the books that architects would say this is history. This is the way history works. It's very interesting because pioneers of modern design, originally pioneers of the modern movement, probably would have just faded away if it hadn't been for one particular institution. And that institution was the Museum of Modern Art. The Museum of Modern Art was created in New York City in the mid-late 1920s. And even though it was dedicated to modern or contemporary art, from the very beginning, it had a mission to document and celebrate achievements in architecture, in recent or contemporary architecture in particular. And so from the beginning, the Museum of Modern Art is interested in looking at architecture and, even more importantly, assembling exhibitions on architecture to show what's going on. Remember that from the very beginning, and the first show at the Museum of Modern Art, which is in 1933, the International Style, is curated. And it is assembling works of architecture from Europe and the United States that seem to have similar visual characteristics. So that show was curated like a museum exhibition. And architecture is looked at very much in this sort of fine art tradition. And it has been that way ever since. And so here we are back to this guy. Ooh, he's looking at the painting. But this really underlies the way architects look at history. Because architects look at history in terms of what buildings or what movements from an aesthetic perspective not only relate to each other, but which ones have design legitimacy in terms of their formal or aesthetic qualities. And that's it. And I'll bet you if you ask, and it would be interesting to see, ask someone who's teaching studio, Pioneers of Modern Design, is a very important, very influential book. It would be very interesting to ask your studio critic, is this your favorite history book? And the more important question to ask them is this really history? Now, an architect is going to tell you, oh yeah, absolutely, it's history. Or is it? It is one way of looking at history, and it's one way of looking at the past. But it is not the only way. In fact, it is a very limited way of looking at history. And so having said that, let's ask these questions again. What is history? It is a chronological record of significant past events, including an explanation of their causes and significance. It is a record of past events. It is a discipline or branch of knowledge that records and explains past events. Or it is a written record presenting related ideas or phenomena from the past. This is a statue in front of the National Archives in Washington. What's past is prologue. The underlying issue with history is that there are themes and ideas that repeat themselves, and there's continuity. Things change, things remain the same. But history is not primarily about aesthetic or formal characteristics. That is not what drives history, and that is not all that history is about. And so you might say, well, what the heck is it? So let's talk about what it is. I think it's very interesting, first of all, to tell you that when you Google history, the vast majority of the images that you see are architecture. And I think this is fascinating because architecture, in more ways than any other item, is evidence of the past. It is evidence of past civilizations, past cultural achievements, politics, and all these things. And in that respect, architecture is a written or documented record of past civilizations, going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. But let's look at that in terms of history as a discipline. The father of history was not some German 19th century person looking at paintings. The father of history is Herodotus, who lives way back, thousands of years ago. Here's the father of history. And he is an interesting guy who documents the Peloponnesian Wars, and there's all this stuff. But let's talk about historians who are not just documenting visual things. And even more importantly, they're not just judging things based on aesthetics. Here, if you ask the images for historian, this is what you get. Now, she does not look like the most hip gal. Maybe she does look hip. But I always joke that since I'm a historian, I have to wear a cardigan sweater because historians wear cardigan sweaters. I mean, there's no Chanel here, okay? So what does a historian do? A real historian. Now, I have to tell you that when I was in graduate school, I was studying architectural history at the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. But I had a friend in the history department, and I said to her once, well, you do regular history, right? And she said, no, I do real history. You do the history of junk. And I thought that was so funny. But for, quote, real historians, looking at stuff based on aesthetics is just sort of suspect because it's not the real deal. So if we're going to take that point of view, what is the real deal? What is real history? And what history involves is the assembling and analysis of evidence. And what is historical evidence? Well, if we ask Google, it really is true that an enormous amount of historical evidence exists in buildings themselves. I'm showing you the Roman Forum here. And if we go back thousands of years, architecture is an incredibly powerful way of documenting past civilizations and past cultures. But there are lots of other ways we can assemble historic evidence. And I always like to start with the ancient world because the ancient world is sort of the foundation for everything. And all of these artifacts are historical evidence. And you can see there are lots of different things. There are coins, there's armor, there's pottery, whatever. And when we talk about the ancient world and archaeology in particular, I know you'll probably all be horrified to learn that I saw the first Indiana Jones movie in the theater when I was a teenager. I know you can't believe it, but I remember that these Indiana Jones movies were just this huge phenomenon when I was in my teens. And you watch The Big Bang Theory and the legend lives on. And the point I'm trying to make here is that there's this real romance in this idea of archaeology, this really sexy guy with a whip and a fedora going out and getting artifacts to put in the museum and study. Well, the assemblage of historical evidence of any kind, but certainly in archaeology, is a painstaking, very difficult, very complicated, challenging process where you have to be very careful, and it's literally peeling back the layers, peeling the onion to understand the record from the past. And sometimes what you find from the past can be complex. And I don't know, everybody dies, right? But sad in a way. We know a lot about past civilizations, in some cases from mass death. If you think about the eruption of Pompeii, the explosion of Mount Vesuvius, and the complete destruction of the city of Pompeii in 79 AD, we know so much about that city, that ancient Roman city, because tens of thousands of people were literally buried alive. The volcano and the ash and the fire and everything that happened was so intense that it preserved the city in a flash. But lots and lots of people lost their lives as a result. So that's not, that's complicated. It's not one or the other. It's not good or bad. It's a complicated thing. And on the one hand, this, coming across graves or human remains is very interesting in terms of getting information. But if you try to imagine these people with skin and clothing and families and what were their lives like, and is it just their skeletons that reveal what is past? This is just a fraction of who they were when they walked the earth. And history is really taking bits and pieces from the past, and a skeleton is just a fraction. It's a very important part of a human being, but it's only a part. And the process of history is taking the bits and pieces from the past and making an effort to reconstruct it and understand it. And so I'm showing you reconstructions of ancient, or prehistoric skeletons to give you a sense of what people might have looked like. And we can approximate the past based even on a limited amount of information. And of course, we do that with architecture too. We can find ancient civilizations and cities and buildings from the past. And with the evidence that they present to us, that gives us an idea of what it must have been like when the buildings were new and being used. And there are lots and lots of examples of this. But I want to remind you that whether we are talking about the ancient world or we're talking about the 17th century, which is where we're going to start on Thursday, it's only a fragment. And I'm showing you, remember Herodotus, the Greek historian, the father of history, his histories, there are only bits and pieces of the pages left. So even the history itself is a fraction of what was there. Now, I love to show the map of the world according to Herodotus, because remember, anybody who's writing history or looking at history or looking at the past is also looking at it based on the information that they have. And based on the information that Herodotus had in ancient Greece, this is what he thought the world looked like. And that in and of itself is an extremely useful bit of information, because that reveals a window on his viewpoint of the world. So if you look again at the map according to Herodotus, and we know the limitations of the geography of Herodotus's world based on this map, this is the same map today showing us all these cities, these ancient Greek and Roman cities. Actually, I think it's mostly Greek. It's Greek colonies, actually. But the point is that the understanding of Herodotus and the world is very different from our understanding, because we have a lot more information. We have so much more information that we can have a much more accurate, if you will, or complex or complete view of the past. And again, here's the world according to Herodotus, and here's a modern map of Europe. There's a huge difference, isn't there? There's an enormous difference. But it's not a judgment that one is better than the other. There's a push me, pull you, there's a tension between these two. And there is a lot to be learned from looking at both. One is not better than the other. This is not picking the painting that is superior. This is not making a formal judgment based on aesthetic criteria. This is looking at the evidence that is available and the information that is available in a particular time and place, and having that help us interpret the past. And so we're going to find, and anybody who's taken my classes knows that I have this very serious map obsession. We are going to look at so many maps, and maps are incredibly useful because they literally are our guide. And maps change throughout history, and we're going to look at so many, and you're going to find them to be very useful and very instructive, especially as they change over time. And so then the question is, what is our compass? And I love this little boat sort of sailing the ocean blue. What is our compass and what is our guide as we study history? How are we going to sort of unpack and understand the past? And of course, how architecture and urbanism and all of these aesthetics, design issues fit into that. These are the ideas. And remember, architecture doesn't come first. Architecture is a product of all of these things. And we have to start with the historical thing, these issues that shape history, because that's what gives us architecture. Politics, very important. And I just brought these collages because you can see just how complex these issues are. Economics, let me tell you something. And this is not just because I run a business with 40 people and I've been in business for 16 years. If you don't have money, there's no architecture. That was true in the ancient world. It was true in the Renaissance. It's true now. If you don't have money, you're not going to build anything. So economics and money and issues of finance and all of those things are critical to understanding the development and the creation of architecture. If you don't have a client who pays for it, it doesn't get built. And it's just that simple. It doesn't start with the architect. It starts with the client. And it starts with the political and economic circumstances that will allow buildings to be created. And of course, it's cultural too. And I was trying to decide which of these to use, but I thought this was kind of a useful diagram because art, drama, and you could put architecture is just a piece of this cultural landscape. So architects have a tendency to be architecture-centric. Now, don't get me wrong. Architecture is my life. I have loved buildings since I was a child. I live, breathe, and sleep architecture. I love it. But there's a lot more to it than just, is it a good building, is it a bad building, and where does it fit into this museum exhibition? History is so much more complicated than that. And so that is how we're going to approach this. If I have one word for you that I want you to remember and take away from this class, it is context. You cannot understand anything that is designed, whether it's a painting or a vase or a building or a city, unless you put it into historical context. And historical context is taking into account the politics, the economics, and the culture of the time and place that produced whatever building you're looking at. Context matters. If you look at just one of these squares, it doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, maybe you can figure out you're looking at an elephant if you look at this one square, but if you look at just this square or just that square, you're not going to know you're looking at the elephant. You're not going to know the big picture. And that's why context matters. And so, ladies and gentlemen, come with me on this adventure. We are going to be the explorers. And in this case, our compass is going to be history. History will be our guide. Politics, economics, culture. And that is going to teach us and provide the means or the map, the roadmap to learning about architecture. And in architecture in the New World, I brought images from Henry Hudson. That's the guy who discovered the Hudson River. And these are just images because we are focusing on the New World, the colonies that eventually become the United States. And that is where we are going to start on Thursday. So I will see you then.